Okay, so now we've seen where to control shutter speed on your camera. What does it do? So these are two images. Top one up here is that weird bowl down at like Lower Manhattan near Wall Street. And this is a 20-second exposure. So I put the camera on a tripod, hit the shutter button, had it set for 20 seconds, and right, 20 seconds later, closed the shutter and made an exposure. Um, some of you may be wondering, okay, well, why is it not like incredibly bright? I had a neutral density filter over the lens. It's sort of like sunglasses for your camera, which allowed me to make a very long exposure during the day. And even though, like if I had made that exposure and I was at ISO 100 and I was at, f22, that still would have been letting in way too much light, right? Because it's very bright out and I'm doing this very long exposure. So putting that neutral density filter on allowed me to have a reasonable exposure at the end of 20 seconds. But it doesn't matter. 20 seconds, right? All the people start to blur out, any cars blur out. This person here who's not moving very much, at least, like they are much more visible than, say, this person over here who stopped to take a picture and then moved. And so we have part of that 20 seconds has them here, part of the 20 seconds has just the background there, and so we have kind of a half and half image of them, and then a lot of these people here are just sort of like streaky, blurry, nothingness. Down here we have, of course, unicycle basketball. I mean, if you don't major in photography, you might as well major in unicycle basketball. I mean, it pays better, but so these folks are obviously moving around a lot, right? You can't really stand still on a unicycle. You're always kind of wobbling some. But in this shot, they look very crisp and frozen because it's shot at a 1250th of a second. So again, right, a longer shutter speed will allow things in motion to blur. Right? How does that work? Well, I'm seeing them here, and then during that 20 seconds, I'm also seeing them here and 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 here. So if they are in motion, I'm seeing them in multiple positions over the course of that exposure. And that means that they are sort of a streak going from one position to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, toward that final position. Right, so that means if they're moving very fast, right, they're going to be a bigger streak because they will have gone farther during that 20 seconds or half a second. If they're moving slower, they will be less of a streak because they will not have moved as far. So it's always a little bit of a balancing act, right? If I have a very fast exposure and a very fast subject, right, they may still be a little bit blurry. If I'm taking a picture of a race car close up at a 500th of a second, right, I'm still going to have a blurry race car because it's moving so fast that even during that relatively brief period of time, it has made a big move in my frame. So that's how shutter speed sort of manifests itself visually, right? Aperture controls depth of field, shutter speed controls motion blur. So let's look at some slightly more scientific-y examples. This is my very scientific cup and ball toy, right? Designed in Swiss labs for precision photography demos. So all these things, right? I just had the cup and ball toy and tipped it over and the ball fell out. So the first one that we see here, this is at a 1,000th of a second. And it looks as though it's not moving at all. And remember that, right? Very fast, looks like it's not moving, right? That will come in to the next slide lecture. But the string here, right, seems very static. That ball there on the end, right, seems like it's hanging there. It almost looks like the string is made of wire and it's just doing 1,000th of a second. If I go to a 250th of a second, right, so that 1,000th of a second, half as fast, 500th of a second, half as fast again, a 250th of a second. So here we have, whoops, if I can point at it, right, there's a string, all of that looks pretty static still, but as I get to the end of it, right, we start to see this blur in that string there and a little bit of blur in the ball. It's not super noticeable, but compared to this one, right, where it's just like, we do start to see that blurriness in the shot. Now let's go down to, that was a 250th. Here we have a, can I get it over there? There we go. This is a 60th of a second. So 250th, twice as long, from a 250th to 125th, 125th to a 60th. So here we have a 60th of a second, and you can see some really significant blur in that string. We're also starting to see some like elongation of the form of the ball, right? Because we're seeing it here and also there. You can also see here in the specular highlight, right? So that's the reflective piece of the ball. We're also starting to see that stretch. And that's going to be a really good way to tell if there is some motion in your shot. Look for a specular highlight. There's sort of like a nice, small, bright thing. And as they move, you'll be able to sort of see them streak in one direction or another. And whatever direction they're going in, that's the direction the object is moving in. So here, right, the cup, right, this isn't moving that much. The hand isn't moving that much. This part of the string isn't moving that much. But by the time we get down here, a lot of motion and a lot of blur, right? This is really visibly in motion, right? Especially if we think of it in comparison to that first one at a 1,000th of a second where it seemed completely static. Now let's go and look at a 30th of a second. So 30th of a second, this is like blurry to the point almost of invisibility, right? I know what it is because I saw the other pictures, but if I hadn't, you know, I wouldn't necessarily know what's happening in here. I see the string has sort of disappeared. The ball is, you know, barely visible. So at a 30th of a second, that is a lot of blur. Now there's something else happening too. If I look in the background at that switch plate, you'll notice that compared to the one at a 60th, that switch plate also looks a little blurry. And that's not because the switch plate is moving, right? It's not like earthquake. That's because my camera, I can't hold it steady. So remember I said that I like to, you know, shoot at least an 80th of a second. This was at a 30th of a second, and so I've been unable to hold my camera steady enough. And so not only is the object moving, but my entire camera is shaking a little bit, and that makes everything, irrespective of whether or not it is itself in motion, appear blurry. So that's camera shake. That's sort of what it manifests itself as. It means that even if you were like, oh, I'm going to make this like super focused and everything is great, my depth of field's great, if your camera's moving around, right, then you're going to have a not sharp picture. Okay, so that is a little bit of the technical side of things with shutter speed and what it does, i.e. motion blur. So now we will take a look at how people have used that in photography and what they have done with it.